It was a night destined to be remembered, or perhaps deliberately forgotten. Two of the greatest musical forces of the 20th century, bound by talent, ambition, and the intoxicating pulse of creativity, were about to meet in the same studio. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, a man whose obsession with perfection had become legendary, arrived with his trademark meticulousness, armed with an ear tuned to every nuance of sound. Freddie Mercury, Queen's flamboyant frontman, a living hurricane of charisma and theatrical genius, stepped in, carrying the weight of decades of bold innovation and unapologetic originality. At first glance, it seemed like a dream, the collaboration that fans had fantasized about, whispered about in hushed tones at late-night parties, and speculated over in music magazines for years. The promise was monumental. Could the raw, unrestrained genius of Mercury blend seamlessly with Jackson's polished, almost supernatural sense of rhythm and melody? Could the music they would create together shatter every boundary, defy every genre, and redefine the very meaning of collaboration? But within minutes, that dream teetered on the edge of chaos. The air, initially charged with excitement, began to thicken with subtle tension. Mercury's instinctive, sometimes reckless, spontaneity clashed almost immediately with Jackson's exacting precision. The notes they laid down seemed to vibrate with energy. Yet beneath the brilliance lurked a growing unease, an unspoken question neither dared to voice aloud. Can two colossal egos coexist in the same creative space without shattering everything in their path? And then it happened. A disagreement over a single chord, a subtle shift in phrasing, a hesitation that should have been invisible but wasn't. The music, instead of binding them, highlighted their differences. And as the session wore on, the world outside remained oblivious, blissfully unaware that a historic moment in music was unraveling in real time. What the audience would never see was the fragile web of personalities at play. One misstep could ignite a fire that would consume the collaboration entirely. And by the end of that night, whispers of discord would replace the euphoric anticipation that had brought these legends together. The question hung in the air. Heavy, unyielding, irresistible. What exactly happened that night? Behind the closed doors of a recording studio, that made one of the most anticipated musical partnerships in history crumble before it even began. To understand the explosion that was about to occur, we must first understand the forces at play. Freddie Mercury was not just a singer. He was a living embodiment of theatrical genius. Born Farrokh Bulsara, he had transformed himself into a figure larger than life, a man who could command a stadium with a single note, whose performances blurred the line between music and drama. Mercury's approach to art was instinctive, impulsive, and fearless. A melody could twist and turn at his whim, lyrics could shift to match the intensity of his emotion, and every performance was a riotous, intoxicating spectacle. He thrived in chaos, in experimentation, in the raw energy of creation without boundaries. Michael Jackson, in contrast, had built his empire on an almost fanatical pursuit of perfection. Every note, every breath, every pause was calculated, dissected, and refined until it approached the impossible. Jackson's genius was rooted in control, in precision, in an unwavering commitment to sonic perfection. Where Mercury thrived in spontaneity, Jackson demanded discipline. Where Mercury relished unpredictability, Jackson sought predictability in execution. Yet it was this contrast that made the idea of a collaboration irresistible. Two artists, masters in their own right with radically different philosophies about music, stepping into the same space. On paper, it was pure electricity. In reality, it was a high-wire act with no safety net. Each had achieved the pinnacle of success in their own world, but neither had been forced to compromise on their vision at this level before. The studio, a room designed for creation, would also become a crucible where their very identities would be tested. Even their personal histories hinted at conflict and brilliance intertwined. Mercury had always thrived on defiance, against norms, against expectations, against the audience itself. Jackson had learned early that the world could break you if you didn't control every detail. Both had demons, both had vulnerabilities, both had obsessions. And both carried the unspoken burden of legacy, the fear that anything less than extraordinary would tarnish everything they had built. And so, as they prepared to merge these two worlds, an invisible tension hovered. Would Mercury's chaotic brilliance fuel Jackson's structured precision? Or would it ignite a clash neither was prepared for? Could a creative miracle emerge from the collision of these two minds, or would their differences prove too vast, too deep, too personal to overcome? By the time the first notes rang out in the studio, it was already clear that history would remember this session. Not just for the music that might have been, but for the drama unfolding just beneath the surface. And as the music began, so did the first sparks of tension, a tension that would grow with every chord, every lyric, every note. What neither of them knew was that the very qualities that made them legends were about to push them into irreconcilable conflict. The studio doors opened, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. It was not just a room. It was a battlefield of talent, a cathedral of sound where every vibration could reveal a genius or ignite a feud. Mercury arrived first, his presence immediate and commanding, a spark of raw energy that seemed to ripple across the room. Moments later, Jackson entered, meticulous, calm, but with a quiet intensity that radiated control. At first, there was a tentative respect, a mutual acknowledgement of greatness. The first few bars of the collaboration were electric. Mercury's voice soared effortlessly over Jackson's rhythm, each complementing the other in a rare and beautiful synergy. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed the world might indeed witness a creation worthy of legends. The notes danced, the melodies intertwined, and the possibility of magic shimmered in the air like electricity. Yet even in those early moments, subtle cracks appeared. Mercury, accustomed to bending music to his whim, would improvise a line, a flourish, or a vocal inflection that deviated from Jackson's meticulously planned rhythm. Jackson, with his perfectionist ear, would pause, frown, and insist on adjustment, replaying sections, slowing the tempo, demanding precision. The clash of instincts was quiet at first, an eyebrow raised here, a sigh barely audible there, but it was enough to plant the seeds of tension. Producers and engineers watched silently, sensing the precarious balance. On one side, there was Mercury's irrepressible charisma and willingness to take risks. On the other, Jackson's unwavering focus, a relentless drive for perfection that brooked no deviation. The room vibrated not just with music, but with unspoken questions. Who would dominate? Whose vision would prevail? How long before the collision became inevitable? Then came the first real argument, a disagreement over phrasing. Mercury suggested a line delivered with raw, unpolished emotion. Jackson insisted it needed to be tighter, more controlled. The exchange was polite on the surface, but charged beneath with pride, fear, and the weight of legacy. Both men realized in that moment that compromise would not come easily. As the session continued, the tension escalated. Each note played was a negotiation. Each lyric sung a test of patience and will. And as the night stretched on, the atmosphere thickened. What began as mutual admiration now teetered on the edge of frustration. The dream of collaboration, for all its potential brilliance, was revealing itself as a delicate dance between genius and ego, artistry and obsession. The final note of the night rang out. Beautiful yet incomplete, shimmering with promise and fraught with unspoken conflict. And as Mercury and Jackson retreated to opposite corners of the studio, a question lingered in the air like a haunting echo. Could two of the greatest musical minds ever coexist in the same space? Or was this encounter destined to end in creative disaster? The next day, the studio seemed almost alive. The air hummed with anticipation, electric with the possibility of genius. Mercury, brimming with energy, entered first, and Jackson followed. Calm yet alert, every movement deliberate. His eyes scanning the room as though measuring every object, every note, every potential misstep. Both men knew that history might hinge on what happened here, but history was patient, and so were they for now. The first takes were mesmerizing. Mercury's voice, untethered and bold, soared over Jackson's meticulously crafted beats. Every note seemed to vibrate with a kind of reckless freedom. It was intoxicating. The two artists seemed to feed off each other's energy, producing lines that shimmered with possibility. For a fleeting moment, the world outside the studio could have believed they had achieved musical transcendence. but the brilliance was fragile. Mercury, whose genius thrived on spontaneity, began bending melodies on instinct. A riff here, a vocal flourish there, unplanned, unapologetic, exhilarating. Jackson, trained to pursue perfection, flinched at each deviation. He would replay the same section 10, 15, 20 times until the timing, pitch, and rhythm were flawless. Each repetition, intended to refine, began to fray the edge of Mercury's patience. Words were exchanged, polite at first, with subtle tension lurking beneath. Mercury would gesture, insisting the emotion mattered more than precision. Jackson would counter, soft but firm, that perfection was itself a form of emotion, that structure amplified feeling. The room, which moments ago had vibrated with creative electricity, now pulsed with the low hum of conflict. The session became a battlefield of vision. Mercury's philosophy: let the music breathe, let the notes live, let chaos give birth to brilliance. Jackson's philosophy: every sound must be honed, every beat measured, every harmony precise. Their instincts, both extraordinary in isolation, collided like tectonic plates. Sparks flew, sometimes musical, sometimes human. Producers tried to mediate, suggesting compromises, alternative arrangements, or minor adjustments. But every intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, only heightened the tension. Mercury felt constrained, boxed in by rules he neither respected nor understood. Jackson felt undermined, frustrated that his meticulous efforts were interpreted as rigidity rather than mastery. And yet, the magic still lingered. There were moments of such brilliance that even the tension seemed irrelevant. A note, a harmony, a fleeting cadence. They would look at each other, and for a heartbeat the world disappeared, replaced only by music. But those moments were brief. Each spark of brilliance was shadowed immediately by the clash of their visions. By the end of the session, exhaustion and frustration had set in. Mercury retreated into flamboyant gestures of exasperation, while Jackson methodically organized his notes and recordings as though to impose order on chaos. Both left the studio carrying an unspoken question. Could their artistic differences ever be reconciled, or was the collision of their brilliance doomed to implode? The night left a lingering tension, a whisper that hinted the real conflict had only just begun. And somewhere, beneath the music, beneath the notes, both men sensed the fragile line between collaboration and confrontation was thinning rapidly. What would break first? The music or the men themselves? The next morning brought no relief. In fact, the pressure intensified. Outside the studio, the world imagined a seamless collaboration, two legends creating magic. Inside, reality was far messier, a labyrinth of expectations, egos, and unrelenting demands. Jackson, ever the perfectionist, scrutinized every detail of the previous session. Every vocal take, every note of Mercury's piano, every rhythmic nuance of the drum beat. He analyzed, recalculated, replayed. The obsession with flawless execution was not arrogance, it was fear. Fear that anything less than perfect would betray his legacy. Mercury, by contrast, felt the pressure differently. His genius had always thrived in chaos, yet the scrutiny, the replaying of sections, the constant insistence on structure began to feel like a cage. Each time Jackson demanded precision, Mercury bristled, his natural instinct to improvise chafing against the rigidity imposed upon him. It was not merely artistic disagreement. It was a clash of identity. Mercury's brilliance was spontaneity. Jackson's was meticulousness. The studio, now a crucible of these conflicting forces, amplified every tension. A single note could trigger an argument. A single phrase could provoke a silent standoff. Each session became a delicate dance between two titans, neither willing to concede ground, both aware of the stakes. The music they sought to create demanded unity, yet unity felt like surrender, and surrender for either of them was unthinkable. As the day progressed, small incidents accumulated into larger fractures. Jackson requested re-recordings, sometimes 5, sometimes 10 times, until every sound matched his ideal. Mercury's retorts, playful at first, turned sharper. He questioned the obsession with perfection, arguing that music must live and breathe, that emotion mattered more than exactitude. Their dialogue, which began as conversation, began to resemble a battlefield of philosophy. But pressure was not only internal. Producers, managers, and advisors hovered like specters, reminding them of deadlines, potential sales, and public expectations. Each comment, each suggestion carried weight. Mercury, accustomed to creative autonomy, bristled at intrusion. Jackson, accustomed to control, resented any perceived inefficiency. The music itself became secondary to the struggle to preserve authority over their respective domains. Amidst this tension, moments of brilliance still emerged. Mercury would deliver a vocal line of raw, unfiltered emotion. Jackson would echo it with exacting harmony, producing a sound so exquisite it seemed almost otherworldly. In those fleeting instances, both men glimpsed the potential of what they could create together. But these flashes were like lightning, beautiful, illuminating, yet impossible to hold. As night fell, exhaustion and frustration had transformed into quiet resentment. The pressure to create perfection had begun to erode the fragile connection between the two legends. What had started as a dream collaboration now felt like a high-stakes negotiation, with every note, every lyric, and every beat scrutinized through the lens of fear and ego. The session ended, not with resolution, but with lingering tension. Mercury left with a flamboyant flourish masking his irritation. Jackson stayed behind, methodically cataloging takes, silently questioning whether the collaboration could survive. Outside the studio, fans dreamed of music that might never exist. Inside, two of the greatest musical minds ever confronted an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, brilliance alone is not enough to bridge a gulf of perfection, pride, and personal philosophy. And as the night's silence fell over the empty studio, one question hovered in the shadows, unresolved, haunting. Would the next session bring reconciliation and genius, or would the pressure finally shatter the fragile alliance between Freddie Mercury and Michael Jackson? The next studio session began with a brittle air, one heavy with anticipation but darker than before. Mercury arrived, radiant in confidence, as if nothing could dim his creative fire. Jackson followed, calm, precise, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of tension. The initial excitement that had electrified previous sessions now carried an undercurrent of dread. Both men knew something fragile was unraveling, yet neither fully grasped the depth of what was to come. The first takes revealed the cracks immediately. Mercury's instincts urged him to bend melodies, to twist lyrics in the moment, to experiment with harmonies in ways that defied convention. Jackson, whose genius thrived on structure, immediately halted the music, requesting replays, corrections, and adjustments. The clash, once manageable, was no longer a minor friction. It had become a chasm. Words were exchanged, polite but loaded with subtext. Mercury challenged Jackson's obsession with control, insisting that music needed emotion over perfection. Jackson countered with calm authority, arguing that precision was not limitation. It was the vessel through which emotion could reach its fullest power. The room seemed to contract with tension, the very air vibrating with unspoken confrontations. Even the producers felt the shift. They had witnessed creative tension before, but this was different. These were two titans of music, each unwilling to yield, each with egos, reputations, and personal legacies at stake. Minor disagreements escalated rapidly. A single note missed, a lyric delivered differently than expected, a hesitation in rhythm, all became catalysts for silent standoffs and tense exchanges. At one point, Mercury's voice cracked slightly, not from vocal strain, but from the pressure of compromise. Jackson noticed immediately, his focus sharpening, his perfectionist instincts kicking in. He requested the section be redone, and what should have been a minor adjustment became a test of patience. Mercury bristled, turning frustration into sharp wit, and a verbal sparring match began. Each sentence was a subtle challenge, each retort a defense of artistic identity. The breakdown was no longer just about music. It was about control, ego, and identity. Mercury's flamboyant, free-form genius resisted containment. Jackson's disciplined, meticulous approach demanded order. The collision of these two philosophies ignited a tension that could not be smoothed over by talent alone. And yet, amidst the escalating conflict, moments of brilliance still appeared. like flickers of lightning in a stormy sky. Mercury would deliver a line of raw emotion. Jackson would respond with perfect harmonization. The resulting music was transcendent but fleeting. These moments reminded both men, painfully, of what could be achieved if only the tension could be managed. As the session ended, frustration lingered like smoke in the room. Mercury left with a flamboyant flourish masking his irritation. Jackson retreated into meticulous silence, cataloging recordings as though trying to impose order on chaos. Neither could ignore the growing realization. This collaboration was teetering on the edge of collapse. The question remained, haunting and unresolved. Was it too late to save the music? Or had pride and perfection already doomed it? As if the tension inside the studio wasn't enough, the world outside began to encroach on the fragile collaboration. Managers, producers, and advisors hovered like unseen specters, each with their own agendas. Their whispers, suggestions, and concerns added weight to an already precarious balance. Mercury, who had thrived on artistic freedom, bristled at interference. Jackson, who sought control over every note, grew increasingly frustrated that others could influence his meticulous vision. Producers pushed for adjustments aimed at commercial appeal. "This section needs to be catchier," one suggested. "The chorus must be more structured," another insisted. Each comment, though seemingly practical, felt like a provocation. Mercury's improvisational instincts rebelled. He felt boxed in by constraints, as if the music itself were being stripped of its soul. Jackson, meanwhile, perceived the interventions as challenges to his authority and control. He insisted that every change serve the perfection of the sound, not the fleeting taste of popularity. Even the media, though unaware of the studio drama, cast shadows over the sessions. Rumors circulated about the collaboration, and the weight of expectation became almost tangible. Both artists were aware of the scrutiny, and the pressure to deliver a masterpiece intensified their insecurities. Mercury, already sensitive to external judgment, felt a tightening in his creative expression. Jackson, whose career had been defined by responding to criticism with relentless refinement, became even more exacting. Personal differences magnified the external pressures. Mercury's flamboyance and unpredictability clashed with Jackson's disciplined, almost obsessive methods. Where Mercury sought freedom, Jackson sought control. Where Mercury thrived in chaos, Jackson demanded order. The pressure from external voices transformed the creative friction into a psychological battleground. Even friends and collaborators, well-meaning as they were, sometimes inflamed the tension. "Don't let him take over," a producer whispered to Mercury. "Stay focused. Don't get sidetracked," an assistant reminded Jackson. Each subtle remark added fuel to the fire, eroding trust and cooperation. Every suggestion, every hint of interference was interpreted through the lens of ego, pride, and fear. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, the music occasionally soared. Mercury would deliver a line of unprecedented emotional depth. Jackson would match it with harmonies so precise they seemed almost preternatural. The potential was undeniable, but the very forces that produced these moments of brilliance, their genius, their egos, their contrasting philosophies, were the same forces threatening to destroy the collaboration entirely. By the end of these sessions, exhaustion, frustration, and resentment had begun to dominate. Mercury left with a theatrical flourish, masking irritation and disappointment. Jackson lingered, meticulously reviewing recordings, silently weighing every note, every phrase, every possible adjustment. The collaboration, which had begun with so much promise, now stood at a crossroads, teetering between potential brilliance and imminent collapse. A single unresolved question hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Could the next session salvage what had begun as a historic meeting of musical minds, or had outside pressures and irreconcilable differences already sealed its fate? The morning after the most turbulent session, the studio was silent. Outside, the world remained unaware of the storm that had erupted behind closed doors. But inside, both Mercury and Jackson were haunted by echoes of their own brilliance, and the cracks that had begun to fracture it. The music, once a vessel of possibility, had become a mirror reflecting vulnerabilities, frustrations, and fears. Freddie Mercury walked alone through the corridors of the studio. The flamboyant confidence that usually radiated from him now tinged with doubt. He replayed every moment in his mind, the improvisation that had been cut, the insistence on precision that had stifled spontaneity, the subtle gestures of frustration he had sensed in Jackson. For the first time in years, Mercury felt constrained, boxed in by forces beyond his control. His genius, so often untethered and free, now felt caged. Michael Jackson, on the other side of the studio, immersed himself in the meticulous review of recordings. Every note, every inflection, every pause was dissected with obsessive care. His mind, a precise machine trained for perfection, could not reconcile the unpredictability of Mercury's improvisations with the vision he held for the song. For Jackson, the emotional fallout was not just about music, it was about legacy. If this collaboration failed, would it be remembered as an artistic triumph left incomplete, or a clash of egos that should never have occurred? Both men carried an unspoken weight, the awareness that something extraordinary had been within reach, yet something had gone awry. Mercury questioned whether he had compromised too much, or if Jackson's precision had suffocated what could have been transcendent. Jackson questioned whether his pursuit of perfection had alienated the very genius he sought to collaborate with. In their own ways, each felt responsible for the fragile tension that now hovered like a storm cloud over the project. The emotional fallout extended beyond professional frustration. Both men wrestled with fear, regret, and lingering what-ifs. Mercury, always larger than life, confronted the rare vulnerability of creative impotence, his flamboyance offering no armor against the creeping doubt. Jackson, accustomed to controlling every element of his craft, faced the rare uncertainty of unpredictability, a force he could neither measure nor dominate. Yet even in this fragile state, flashes of brilliance haunted them. Mercury could still hear the fleeting harmonies that had danced between their voices. Jackson could still sense the moments where their instincts had briefly aligned. These memories were bittersweet reminders that the potential for genius had existed, tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly beyond reach. The emotional fallout left both men at a crossroads. Could they reconcile their differences and channel the tension into creation, or had pride, perfectionism, and personal demons already done irreparable damage? And in that silent studio, a haunting question lingered, unanswered. Was the dream of collaboration already slipping away, or could it still be salvaged? The truth, the one that would ultimately define this ill-fated collaboration, was more complicated than anyone imagined. It wasn't a simple clash of personalities, nor just a matter of creative difference. It was an intricate web of ego, insecurity, ambition, and history, all colliding in the confines of a studio that had never contained such intensity before. On paper, Freddie Mercury and Michael Jackson were perfectly matched, two of the greatest voices of their generation, two icons capable of bending music to their will. But in reality, their genius operated on fundamentally different wavelengths. Mercury's creativity was chaotic, impulsive, a force of raw emotion and instinct. Jackson's genius was structured, disciplined, exacting, a machine finely tuned for precision. Where one thrived in freedom, the other demanded control. Where one embraced spontaneity, the other feared deviation. The tipping point arrived subtly, almost invisibly, during a recording of what should have been a routine bridge section. Mercury improvised, layering harmonies in unexpected ways, exploring emotional textures that transcended the melody. Jackson, hearing the deviation, froze. For him, perfection was not an aesthetic choice. It was a moral imperative, a commitment to music as a sacred craft. The improvisation, beautiful as it was, felt like chaos invading order, a breach he could not tolerate. A subtle argument erupted, polite on the surface but searing underneath. Mercury insisted that emotion should guide the notes. Jackson countered that structure-amplified emotion. Each was right, each was unyielding. And in that moment, the collision of philosophies revealed something deeper. The failure was not just about notes or timing, it was about identity. Each man's approach to music was inseparable from his sense of self. To compromise fully would be to surrender a piece of the soul, something neither could do. The studio became a crucible. External pressures, the producers urging commercial viability, managers whispering about deadlines and public expectation, only intensified the strain. Mercury felt trapped, Jackson felt undermined, and the music suffered. The brilliance that had occasionally shone through was now eclipsed by frustration, a reminder that genius alone cannot reconcile irreconcilable methods. And yet, there were moments that hinted at what could have been. A fleeting harmony, a shared laugh, a note held in perfect alignment, brief flashes where chaos and control, emotion and precision collided beautifully. But these were ephemeral, as if the universe itself could not allow such two forces to remain perfectly in sync. By the end of that fateful session, the hidden truth was undeniable. The collaboration had failed not because of a single event, but because of the complex interplay of personality, philosophy, and unspoken fears. Each man carried the weight of his own brilliance, and when those forces collided, the collision was inevitable. As Mercury left the studio, his usual flamboyance masking his disappointment, and Jackson lingered, cataloging recordings with meticulous care, both were haunted by a single thought. The music that could have been was gone, and it was no one's fault, yet entirely everyone's. A lingering, unanswerable question remained in the air, echoing in every note left unfinished, every harmony unsung. Could two of the greatest musical minds ever truly collaborate? Or are some forms of genius destined to exist only in parallel, never in union? And in that haunting ambiguity lay the story that would define the night. A tale of brilliance, clash, and a masterpiece that remained forever in the realm of possibility. A legend not for what was created, but for what almost was. The tension had reached a fever pitch. By the time Mercury and Jackson returned to the studio for what would become the final session, the atmosphere was electric, but not with excitement. Electric with apprehension. Both men knew that the night could either yield brilliance or destroy the fragile thread that had kept the collaboration alive. Every step, every glance, every pause was loaded with unspoken expectation. From the first chord, the friction was palpable. Mercury's improvisational brilliance collided instantly with Jackson's perfectionist insistence on structure. A single note delivered with raw emotion triggered Jackson's pause. A subtle hesitation in rhythm provoked Mercury's sharp retort. The room, which had once vibrated with the potential for musical transcendence, now trembled under the weight of pride. Fear and unyielding ambition, words polite on the surface, masked the underlying clash of identity. Mercury's flamboyance and need for freedom challenged Jackson's obsessive control. Jackson's meticulous perfectionism questioned Mercury's instinctive genius. Each attempted compromise only revealed deeper fissures. Mercury feared his art would be sanitized, while Jackson feared it would be derailed. Their voices, once harmonious, now carried the sharp edges of ego and doubt. Producers tried to mediate, suggesting minor adjustments, but even the gentlest intervention became a spark for conflict. Perhaps this phrasing could be tightened, a producer offered. Mercury's eyes flashed. Jackson's jaw clenched. Both interpreted the same suggestion as a challenge to their authority. Every note replayed, every harmony refined, became a battleground where music was only the backdrop for a struggle of wills. And then it happened. The pivotal moment that defined the collapse. Mercury, frustrated, delivered a vocal flourish of unprecedented emotional intensity, bending a melody in a way he believed would elevate the song to legendary status. Jackson froze. For him, the deviation was not just artistic, it was personal. Perfection, the very foundation of his genius, had been compromised. He demanded a redo. Mercury refused, insisting that emotion mattered more than precision. The room crackled, the air thick with tension, as two of the greatest musical minds ever faced the impossibility of compromise. In that clash, the hidden truth crystallized. The failure of the session was never about talent. It was about identity, ego, and philosophy. Mercury could not abandon the instinctive, fearless artistry that defined him. Jackson could not compromise the exacting precision that defined him. Both were correct, yet both were incompatible. The music, magnificent in fragments, was doomed in its entirety. By the end of the session, the studio fell silent. Mercury left with a flamboyant flourish, a mask over frustration and grief. Jackson remained, cataloging recordings with mechanical care, his mind haunted by what might have been. The collaboration had failed, not because of a single argument, not because of a single note, but because the collision of two colossal geniuses had produced a force too powerful to contain and too divergent to harmonize. The lingering question, echoing through every unfinished melody and unrecorded harmony, was unavoidable. Could true genius ever coexist without compromise? Or is the cost of greatness always isolation? The story of that fateful collaboration did not end with the final notes of the failed session. Its impact resonated far beyond the studio, rippling through the legacy of both Mercury and Jackson and shaping the mythology of what could have been. Fans speculated, critics debated, and the world imagined a masterpiece that remained forever out of reach. The music that might have been existed only in memory, in fragments, and in the haunting echo of possibility. For Freddie Mercury, the experience reinforced the essence of his artistry. Brilliance required freedom. Any attempt to constrain him, even in the pursuit of perfection, was a threat to the vitality of his genius. He returned to Queen carrying the lessons of collaboration, but also a renewed understanding of the price of compromise. Mercury's future work, more bold and theatrical than ever, bore the imprint of this moment, a reminder that true artistry often demands rebellion. For Michael Jackson, the session became a mirror, reflecting both the power and the vulnerability inherent in his pursuit of perfection. He recognized that even genius has limits when confronted with forces beyond control. Jackson's future recordings, meticulously crafted as always, carried subtle echoes of Mercury's influence, brief flourishes of freedom, daring emotion and unpredictability that would color his music forever. The session had failed, but the encounter left an indelible mark on both artists, shaping their understanding of collaboration, creativity, and compromise. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of that night was the story it told about human ambition and the collision of greatness. It revealed that genius is not merely technical skill or vocal mastery. It is the intricate, fragile interplay of emotion, identity, ego, and instinct. Mercury and Jackson, in their pursuit of musical transcendence, exposed the truth that even the greatest minds can be incompatible, not through lack of talent, but because their brilliance demands autonomy and perfection demands control. The tale of their failed collaboration became more than a story of music. It became a myth, a cautionary tale whispered among musicians and fans alike. It reminded the world that the pursuit of artistic immortality carries risk, that the very forces that create brilliance can also destroy it, and that sometimes the music that could have been is as powerful as the music that exists. In the end, what remains is not failure, but resonance. The echoes of that night linger in every improvised note Mercury sang, in every meticulously refined harmony Jackson perfected, and in the imagination of millions who would forever wonder, what would have happened if these two giants had found common ground? The story closes with reflection. Genius, in all its forms, is a double-edged sword, capable of creating unimaginable beauty, yet impossible to contain when two worlds collide. The collaboration between Freddie Mercury and Michael Jackson serves as a reminder that some forms of brilliance are destined to exist side by side, never fully merging, yet forever shaping the cultural and emotional landscape of music. And as the studio doors closed, as the final echoes faded into silence, one thought remained. The music that might have been is immortal, not in sound, but in legend, in memory, and in the haunting possibility of what two of the greatest artists ever could have achieved together. The collaboration may have failed, but the story endures, a mythic resonance that leaves the listener with awe, longing, and the haunting question that will never be answered.